The stars burned behind Queen Lysandra as her ship fell apart in space, and the Void Collective had destroyed everything she loved, and her home planet Etherian was now nothing but ash and fire, and her people were scattered across the galaxy like dust in the wind. She stood in the command center of her dying warship with her silver eyes watching the flames consume her world, and beside her was Zephyros, and he was her bonded dragon, and his scales shimmered like captured moonlight, and he let out a sad cry that echoed through the metal halls. Kalen, her advisor, rushed to her side, and his pointed ears were flat against his head with worry, and he spoke quickly because time was running out, and the enemy ships were getting closer, and they needed to escape now, or they would die with the rest of the fleet. Lysandra looked at the star maps with disgust, and she scrolled through system after system, and all of them were either too dangerous or too far away, and then she saw it, and Earth, and the name made her lip curl because everyone in the galaxy knew about Earth, and it was a primitive backwater planet, and the species there were violent and stupid and barely out of their own atmosphere. She had never wanted to go there, and the Galactic Council had quarantined the planet because humans were too aggressive and too unpredictable, and they fought wars over everything, and they polluted their own world, and they were not ready for galactic society. But now she had no choice, and the void ships were firing on them, and alarms were screaming, and the hull was breaking, and she pressed her finger against the Earth coordinates and told the computer to jump there immediately. The jump drive activated, and reality twisted around them, and colors bled together like paint in water, and then something went wrong, and a void weapon hit their engine core, and the ship lurched violently, and they were spinning out of control. Zephyros roared in her mind, and their telepathic bond filled with panic and fear, and Lysandra held on to the console as everything shook, and the ship was tearing itself apart, and they were going to crash. Through the viewport, she saw Earth growing larger, and it was blue and green and white, and it looked so peaceful and so primitive, and she thought how ironic it was that she would die on a planet she had always looked down upon. The ship screamed through the atmosphere, and metal peeled away, and fire engulfed the hull, and Lysandra grabbed Zephyros and held him close, and she closed her eyes and waited for the end. The impact was like hitting a wall of stone, and everything went black. Lysandra woke up in pain, and everything hurt, and her armor was cracked and covered in blue blood, and she could barely breathe because her ribs were broken, and she dragged herself out of the burning wreckage and left a trail of blood behind her. The crash site was massive, and it stretched across the forest like a scar, and trees were knocked down, and the ground was scorched black, and smoke filled the air, and she could feel Zephyros nearby, and he was alive but hurt badly. She had taken maybe 10 steps when she heard vehicles approaching, and they were loud and primitive, and they belched smoke, and she knew it was the humans coming, and she reached for her weapon, but it was broken and useless. Lysandra prepared herself for capture, and she had heard stories about what humans did to aliens, and they would cut her open and study her and use her technology for their wars, and she would rather die than let that happen. But then a woman stepped out of the vehicle, and she was alone and unarmed, and she had dark skin and kind eyes, and she wore simple clothes like a forest worker and not a soldier, and she raised her hands to show she meant no harm. The woman spoke slowly and said her name was Maya, and she would not hurt Lysandra, and she wanted to help because Lysandra was injured and needed medical care. Lysandra tried to stand tall, and she spoke in the galactic language and told Maya to stay back, and she said she was Queen Lysandra of the Silvari Dominion, and she was not some animal to be helped, but then her legs gave out and she started to fall. Maya caught her before she hit the ground, and the human was surprisingly strong, and she held Lysandra gently and told her to take it easy, and they could worry about politics later, but right now she needed help. Behind them came a roar that shook the earth, and Zephyros emerged from the wreckage, and he was enormous and terrifying, and his wings were torn, and one leg was dragging, and he saw Maya holding Lysandra and thought she was attacking. The dragon lunged forward with his fangs bared and ready to kill, and Lysandra screamed at him to stop, and through their mental bond, she commanded him to freeze, and he obeyed. But barely Maya did not run, and that shocked Lysandra because any sane person would have run from an angry dragon, but Maya just stood there trembling but holding her ground, and she said, "Okay, there is a dragon and that is fine, and dragons are fine." She asked Lysandra if she could tell the dragon that she was trying to help, because other humans were coming soon, and they would have bigger guns and smaller brains, and they needed to leave now. Something in Maya's eyes made Lysandra trust her, and maybe it was the kindness there, or maybe it was desperation, but Lysandra reached out through the bond and calmed Zephyros and told him this human was not a threat. The world started spinning, and Lysandra felt herself slipping away, and the last thing she thought before darkness took her was, why would this primitive risk everything to save a stranger? Lysandra woke in darkness, and her body was wrapped in strange fabrics that smelled like pine trees and earth air, and for a moment she panicked and thought she had been captured and imprisoned, but then she felt Zephyros nearby through their bond, and she forced herself to calm down. Footsteps approached, and a soft light turned on, and Maya sat beside a table covered with medical supplies, and she looked relieved and said Lysandra had been unconscious for 2 days, and she was worried. Lysandra sat up slowly, and pain shot through her body, and she had bandages wrapped around her chest and through a doorway. She could see Zephyros in a large barn, and his wounds were also bandaged. She asked Maya where they were, and why had Maya not turned her over to the authorities, and Maya explained they were in an old hunting cabin that belonged to her family, and it was far from any towns and had no cameras or internet, and no one knew they were there. Maya said she had reasons not to trust the government because they would weaponize Lysandra and study her and tear her apart to understand how she worked, and Maya had seen what they did to things they did not understand. Lysandra laughed bitterly and said how noble, and maybe Maya just wanted to sell her to the highest bidder because she knew humans had a reputation for being violent and greedy and obsessed with power. Maya laughed too, but there was no humor in it, and she said yes, humans had earned that reputation, but they were also the species that would run into burning buildings to save a stranger, and they were complicated. She asked Lysandra what she was running from because the crash was not an accident, and the ship looked like it had been through a war. Lysandra touched the royal crest on her armor, and it was cracked and dim, and she had been so focused on surviving that she had not processed the loss of everything she loved, and now, in this quiet place, the grief hit her hard. She whispered about the Void Collective and how they came from the dark spaces between galaxies, and they did not conquer worlds, but consumed them, and turned entire civilizations into raw materials for their war machine. Her people had fought for 3 years, and they held 7-star systems, but in the end, it was not enough. And Lysandra was a queen without a kingdom and a general without an army, and she came to this worthless planet to hide because she had nowhere else to go. She expected Maya to be angry about the insult, but instead Maya looked at her with understanding and said her father had been a soldier, and he served in 3 wars, and came home to die slowly from what the fighting did to him. Maya said she knew what it looked like when someone had lost everything, and she knew that sometimes the only thing keeping you alive was having someone who cared. If you survived another day, she extended her hand to Lysandra, and it was a formal gesture, and she said they could help each other, and Lysandra would keep Zephyros from eating the local wildlife, and Maya would help figure out the next move, and no strings attached and no debts owed. Lysandra stared at the hand, and every instinct told her this was a trap, but Zephyros was calm in her mind and approving, and her dragon had never steered her wrong. She took Maya's hand, and the grip was warm and rough and genuine, and Lysandra said, "Very well." But when this went wrong, she reserved the right to say she told them so. Maya grinned and said she would not have it any other way. 3 weeks passed, and the cabin became something like a home, and Lysandra learned to tolerate Earth's heavy gravity and strange weather, and Maya discovered that an alien queen was surprisingly bad at basic survival tasks, like starting fires or filtering water. Zephyros had developed a taste for Earth's deer, and Maya was not happy about it because he was eating too many, but the dragon seemed happy, and that was something. They were eating dinner one evening, and it was simple food of grilled fish and vegetables, when Zephyros suddenly lifted his head and his eyes blazed with alarm, and through their bond, Lysandra felt it too. There was a wrongness in space, and a familiar, terrible presence pushing against reality like a bruise, and she knew immediately what it was. She said they found her, and the void tracked her ship, and they were coming. Maya was already moving and grabbing an emergency bag. She kept ready, and she asked how long they had. Lysandra said hours or maybe less, and when the void emerged, they would search the entire region until they found her, and everyone within 100 miles would die. She said she needed to leave and draw them away from people, and it was the only way to save lives. But Maya said no, and they should fight instead. Lysandra almost laughed and asked with what, because human weapons would not even scratch void armor, and this was not some story where heroes won against impossible odds, and the void did not negotiate or retreat, and they won through numbers and superior technology. Maya pulled out her phone and typed quickly and said Lysandra was right that they could not win a straight fight, but Earth had been the underdog for all of human history, and they were good at fighting dirty. She said she knew military people who asked fewer questions than they should, and if she could get weapons, and Lysandra told them where to hit the enemy, then maybe they could make the void regret coming to Earth. Lysandra wanted to say no, and protect this human who had shown her kindness. But Zephyros rumbled his agreement, and she felt hope stirring inside her for the first time since her world burned. She said there was a weak point in their shield generators, and their command ships used a network that could be disrupted, and if they could hit the central node, then the void would lose coordination. Maya finished the thought and said they would become vulnerable to concentrated fire, and she knew someone with serious missiles, and it was totally illegal, but desperate times called for desperate measures. They spent the next hour planning, and Maya made calls using careful code words to contacts in the military and civilian world, and Lysandra provided technical details and weak points and attack patterns. Zephyros would be their mobile artillery because his plasma breath could penetrate void armor. The void ships began descending, and there were 3 massive vessels that blocked out the stars, and Maya squeezed Lysandra's hand and said, whatever happened, she did not regret helping her. Lysandra squeezed back, and it was a human gesture she had learned, and she said if they survived, she would need new words for primitive because the ones she used clearly did not apply. Maya laughed and loaded her rifle, and it looked like a toy compared to void weapons, and she said if they survived, then Lysandra had to teach her to fly the dragon. Lysandra agreed, and then the first void dropship screamed overhead, and there was no more time for words. The battle lasted 18 hours, and it changed everything. Humanity thought they knew about their place in the universe. Maya's contacts delivered, and soldiers came from everywhere, and there were special forces, veterans, and National Guard units, and even civilians who somehow had enough weapons to fight a small war. They evacuated the nearby towns with a fake story about a chemical spill, and that gave them a clear battlefield, and it was not much, but it was a start. Lysandra stood on a ridge with her repaired armor shining in the dawn light, and Zephyros was beside her like a mountain of scales and muscle, and below them the human forces assembled in defensive positions. The positions were crude and improvised, and held together with determination and tape, and any proper military tactician would say they had no chance of winning. Then the void landed and everything changed. The humans fought like nothing Lysandra had ever seen, and they adapted instantly when bullets did not work, and switched to fire rounds and explosives and anything that could burn. When the void sent out their shock troops, and they were huge mechanical monsters that ignored plasma fire, a group of soldiers lured them into a canyon and brought down the walls with explosives. Maya coordinated everything from a mobile command post, and her voice was steady as she directed fire and moved units and somehow kept the line from collapsing. Lysandra had been wrong about humans, and they did not win through technology, but through pure, stubborn refusal to give up. Lysandra and Zephyros attacked from above, and the dragon's plasma breath carved through void shields, while Lysandra used her knowledge to direct human artillery. Every attack cost them, and Zephyros took hits that burned his scales, and Lysandra's armor cracked under enemy fire, but they kept fighting. The turning point came when Maya found where the Void command ship landed, and she asked if Zephyros could carry a payload. Lysandra asked what kind of payload. Maya said, 2,000 pounds of explosives and one very determined forest ranger. It was insane, and it violated every rule of warfare that Lysandra knew, and it would probably get them both killed. But Lysandra said Zephyros agreed, and told Maya to climb on. The flight to the command ship was a nightmare of enemy fire and near misses, and Maya held on to the dragon's scales with the explosives strapped to her back. They crashed through the ship's hangar, and Zephyros's claws tore metal, and Maya ran for the shield generator. Maya fought her way to the core with void soldiers everywhere, and Lysandra covered her with a weapon she had found in the wreckage. Maya set the charges, and enemies were closing in, and she screamed at Lysandra to go, and she would trigger the explosives remotely. But Lysandra grabbed the human and ran, and Zephyros was waiting and already flying as they jumped from the hangar. The explosion turned night into day, and the command ship's shields fell like a house made of cards. The human forces were waiting for this moment and unleashed everything they had, and missiles and artillery hit from every direction. The Void, suddenly vulnerable and without leadership, broke formation. They retreated. For the first time in history, the Void Collective retreated from a primitive world. In the aftermath, the sun rose over the burned battlefield, and Lysandra found Maya sitting on a fallen tree, staring at the smoking remains of enemy ships. Maya looked exhausted, and her face was covered in soot and blood, but her eyes were bright. Lysandra said Maya's people would have questions about the ships and about her and about everything that happened. Maya said let them ask, and she had questions too, starting with what happens now. Lysandra looked at Zephyros, who was being admired by a group of amazed soldiers, and she thought about her lost kingdom, and about the Silvery scattered across space. She thought about the humans who fought beside her and bled for a stranger because it was right. She said now she would stop running, and the Void was still out there consuming worlds, but Earth just proved something the galaxy forgot. She said courage and clever thinking could overcome superior force, and primitives, as she foolishly called them, could teach even a queen new ways to fight. Maya asked if Lysandra was saying what she thought she was saying. Lysandra said Earth deserved a voice in galactic affairs, and when she rebuilt her forces, she wanted humans fighting beside her. She extended her hand in the human way and said, starting with a stubborn forest ranger who was too brave for her own good. Maya took her hand and grinned, despite being exhausted, and said when she woke up that morning, she thought the worst thing she would deal with was a bear. Lysandra said she came to Earth expecting savages, and instead found something the galaxy needed, and that was hope. Zephyros roared across the battlefield, and somewhere in the distance, humanity roared back. The war was far from over, but for the first time since her world fell, Queen Lysandra believed they might actually win.